Welcome to Understanding Oklahoma, a series of conversations looking at the richness and also the complexity of the cultures and histories that contribute to Oklahoma's distinctive identity. So happy to say that our guest today is Rilla Askew, who is a novelist and essayist whose writing often focuses on the people and history of Oklahoma. Her novel about the Tulsa Race Massacre, Fire in Beulah, received the American Book Award in 2002. Other writing awards include the Oklahoma Book Award, the Western Heritage Award, and the Arts and Letters Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She teaches creative writing at the University of Oklahoma and is one of the coordinators of this very series. So Rilla, thank you so much for wearing two hats and being with us today for this segment. I remember being very taken with your book that had the title of one of the essays, Most American, where you offer the idea that Oklahoma is a very, in some ways, privileged look at America, most American. Could you talk about, what did you mean by Oklahoma being most American?
I think that our narratives here reflect the master narrative of the United States in powerful ways. And so when I say American in that sense, I'm really specifically talking about the United States of America, our particular story here. There are many Americas, as you know. There are many Americas here in the United States of America. So and I think that it's particularly how our story, how it compresses and inverts the master narrative of westward expansion, of migration, of immigration, and very particularly our story of race in this country, particularly how the native tribes, the indigenous peoples from the southeastern continental United States were forced here in what is really a massive action of ethnic cleansing in the early 1800s. And so that's the beginning of Indian Territory, which eventually became this place that we call Oklahoma. So that's a powerful American narrative, the fundamental American narrative, that and also the enslavement of African peoples. And so Oklahoma's narrative relative to Black Americans is unique. It is the place, it was called the Promised Land for many, many Africans who came here in the post-Reconstruction era from the former Confederate South. And yet the worst race massacre in the nation's history happened in Oklahoma. So it's all how all those narratives blend together. You know, if you think about that, Ralph Ellison, one of our premier Black novelists, Woody Guthrie, one of our primary white working class heroes, and Jim Thorpe, a major and amazing indigenous athlete.
Elizabeth Warren.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm just trying to talk about the fact that in the grounding and the history is that they were all born within just a few years and 100 miles of one another in the very early days of Oklahoma statehood. So that's the kind of blending that happens here. And yes, Elizabeth Warren, who is from here.
I remember being very struck in your essay by a number of things. I mean, it's a really, really interesting view of Oklahoma. A lot of states could claim many of the contradictions about race and slavery and the Confederacy and so on. But you make the point that where Oklahoma is positioned, it's southern, but it's not part of the South. It's by the Southwest, but it's not that. It's in the Midwest, but it's not a Midwestern place. That there's a kind of openness to influence that has made it more representative than almost any other place.
And yet people don't know that. That's probably one of the things that fascinates me the most, because I lived on the East Coast for many, many years, 3 decades and plus, and people there haven't a clue in the world where Oklahoma is. I mean, they know it's out there somewhere. There's a sort of amorphous identity that we have in the national mind, and I think an amorphous identity to Oklahomans themselves. And I think that that's one of the reasons this series is so important, for us to understand how essentially American, speaking of United States of America, that our story is, how everything that happened on the whole continent has happened here, you know, in record time. And some of the narratives are actually an inversion of the national narrative. So, if you want to, whether you take the native story, you take the story of Latinx people here, if you any of the stories that you take, and especially the story of white migration into this state, and also the story of black migration into this state, beginning with the removals, when the 5 tribes were first removed here and brought enslaved African people with them.
I'm kind of smiling to myself thinking about how you've inverted some things very helpfully. There's that famous New Yorker cover where it showed America being the East Coast and the West Coast and sort of nothing in between. And you're basically arguing the opposite,
Yeah.
that everything American is in Oklahoma in a way that, if you'll just open your eyes and look, is very clarifying.
Yes.
So the book that I referenced, Most American, the subtitle also brings up, uses the language, a wounded place. What do you mean by that?
We're wounded in the way that the whole country is wounded. I would say our primary wound is the wound of racism and genocide that began with the native people here, and also essentially the worst incident of white on black violence, the most massive, let me say, happened in Tulsa in 1921, and then was covered up, was made entirely silent, so that I and many others grew up in Oklahoma never having a clue about that, about the force of that history, the power of it, the magnitude of it, the forces that caused it to happen. And so that's also an American story, because we are still to this day covering up. We make a nominal nod to slavery. We make a nominal nod to genocide of Native people, but we very quickly just slide right away from that. And the master narrative, I would say, in this state and in the United States, is the white narrative. And so that's how we understand ourselves. And in terms of numbers, here in Oklahoma, that still is the dominant number, but it's not, and in our media and in our stereotypes of ourselves, it's the dominant narrative. But it is not, in fact, the dominant narrative of Oklahoma. So there's this deep, deep richness and complexity underneath the surface of what we tell, of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And that's why this series, Understanding Oklahoma, is so important. And it's why I think that it's really important for Oklahomans themselves to understand this, because I think we carry a lot of stereotypes about ourselves. And it's really important for the rest of the nation to understand, because what happens here is the story of America.
You know, I was really struck in your essay that you take us somewhere that as a country we haven't been altogether familiar going there. For example, in The Great Gatsby, there's a moment where the Jay Gatsby, the character, is talking to somebody else, and the other person says, "Well, you can't ignore your past. You've got to deal with your past." And Gatsby says, "Oh, well, of course you can ignore it. You can always just, start again." And one of your points, I think, is we can't always just start again. There's a process of owning and acknowledging and then working through something. That's what you mean, I think, by the woundedness, right? We have to enter that process.
And the wound is never healed. The wound cannot be healed until we really open up and acknowledge the full truth of our story and of our history and of where those wounds came from and how that transgenerational trauma continues to affect all of us. So it's not only the populations that suffered the trauma, it's the populations that inflicted the trauma. We're all suffering.
So there's a post-colonial stress disorder that we're all victims of, and we have classic symptoms of our relationship to authority and communities not always relating well to each other, and so on.
Yeah. And we're still so separate from each other. I don't know that all individuals are separate from each other. I have many friends who have really eclectic engagement with other cultures, but I have many friends who don't. And this is also not just about across different cultures, but it's also across classism. There's a great deal of classism in the nation, as there is here in Oklahoma. And so I think that this is classism, ageism, and ableism, I think are three isms that we're not really dealing with yet. And that is of course, a part of our story here, is just as it is everywhere else. But the uniqueness of what has happened here and how quickly it happened and how much it both reflects and inverts and transmogrifies the national narrative is part of what makes Oklahoma so unique, that I think that I sort of want to shout it from the mountaintops. You know, I don't know why we're not. I don't know why everybody doesn't know this.
So just to be clear, so there are problems here that really are everybody's problems. Every state has its contradictions. In some way, every state might be wounded. But I think you're saying until you deal with the particularity of where you are, and until we see Oklahoma as a unique story that only we can tell or be part of the telling of, then that work remains undone.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things that I've witnessed is that people from the dominant culture who do care very much about these things are really in a hurry to get to reconciliation. We're in a real hurry to get to kumbaya, like, you know, like last week, without opening up and understanding, you know, the layers and the truth, the full truth of our history and how complex it is.
Talking about truths and misconceptions, could you say a little bit about maybe some of the misperceptions of Oklahoma? Really?
There are many, both in the state and outside of the state. So having lived, as I said, on the East Coast for many years, and people simply, they either have a Native American stereotype about Oklahoma, or they simply just think of it as some Midwestern vowel state. It starts with an O, Iowa, Ohio, Illinois, I don't know, they're all out there in the middle somewhere. And so have no clue of the particularity of this. Or they think of us entirely as a conservative red state. They think of us as a mini Texas. We are not a mini Texas. Let me just be here to say that very clearly. And internally, I think this is one of the things that I'm most concerned about, is that we dismiss how rich and complex not only our heritage and our past is, but how it is right now. So that there's a kind of, I would say that there's an internalized bias against Oklahoma. We vacillate between this sort of boomer, you know, mentality that just sort of builds us up in a stereotype way that doesn't own all of the wounds, self-inflicted and externally inflicted, that are part of the national narrative on the one hand. Or we have this sort of low self. I had that a lot when I was a kid, and I think a lot of young people growing up in Oklahoma just think it's the big middle of nowhere. It's not an important state. It's
low self-esteem issue.
Yes, low self-esteem. So an egomaniac with low self-esteem. I heard somebody describe themselves that way one day, and I thought, sounds a little bit like some states I know.
But you know, if I think about what we said just a few moments ago, post-colonial stress disorder. You're talking about the symptoms of that disorder. If you're not centered in yourself because you don't know your history, you're kind of a walking ghost of yourself, the kind of thing that Faulkner paradox he likes to get into. You're not the self you could be.
I think that's exactly
if you knew
true.
your history.
That's true.
Yeah. And this is true of many of the segments we're doing. I think people watching this and listening to your words, some of it they're really going to be hearing for the first time. They haven't thought about Oklahoma or culture or a cultural working through in the way you're talking about very deeply. Give us 2 or 3 takeaways that people could keep in mind that would maybe be productive, even if there's a kind of information overload in what you're saying overall. 2 or 3 takeaways that would be useful.
So one thing, all of the above in terms of what I've just said, certainly. But I also think that one segment, though we think of ourselves as a dominant white state, and we think of ourselves really in terms of our 2 particular urban areas, Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and there's much to love about them. But my people come from rural southeastern Oklahoma, and they were the settlers. They came in when it was Indian territory. They came in. They were like, they called them boll weevils. You know, they came in on the cuffs, sneaking over the border when it was still Indian territory. In that case, it was Choctaw Nation, and they didn't have any legal right to live there, and that's how they came, and that's what they did. And so it's sort of going back and recognizing the fullness of our history, and yet I think that there's a minimizing of the rural culture. The rural culture dominates our politics in many, many ways because of how the state was set up, because it was such an agrarian state when it came into the Union. Not to mention the fact that Jim Crow laws were the first laws that were enacted by the state legislature, so you understand many of the core tenets that were set up when Oklahoma became a state. Only 100 and how many years ago? It's 2007. Math is not my thing, but from 1907 to 2007 to 2021.
Right.
Short period of time, and and I think that we tell ourselves a certain kind of story about ourselves that does not acknowledge the full depth of the wounding, and I think that includes, as I said, the people that I come from. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where there's a sort of desire to lay claim and lay hold of an identity that is threatened by acknowledging all the other identities and peoples who are also occupying this same land as we are occupying this land.
It's really hard for a community to grow and be vital when there's that kind of unacknowledgement of other the concerns of other communities.
Yeah, it's true, and we don't know our past. So I'm actually a novelist, but I should have been a historian because that's it. We cannot reckon with today until we know all of the things that came together to create this place, and this place being a microcosm. Speaking of the state of Oklahoma, that is the entire continent. Well, beyond the continent, because we have many of the same kinds of reckonings in our non-continental states, Hawaii and Alaska. So it is the master narrative.
So historicize our personal and our
and it's not hard to do. Yeah. There's a lot of people out there talking about it and writing about it, and
Rilla,
I bet you they're doing YouTubes about it too. What you want to bet?
I bet they are. Yeah. Rilla, thank you so much for talking with us today, and please join us for other segments of Understanding Oklahoma. You take care.